When you meet someone for the first time, you immediately form impressions of that person. The first impressions are usually based on non-verbal observations like the person's appearance. Then you may form opinions based upon what he or she says. So these first early impressions are crucial. They can determine whether or not you wish to continue conversing with this person. And just so as in the introduction of a message, it's very important that you make a positive first impression. It can easily determine whether or not the audience, the congregation, will be motivated to listen to the remainder of what you have to say. So like meeting a person for the first time, the introduction of words, of speech, and alongside the non-verbal elements of you first appearing before a group of people, before you even as a speaker open your mouth, are very important. And of course the opening words that you use may indeed be part of the introduction itself. Now, in the broadest sense of the term, the introduction of a speaker to the audience has two purposes. Therefore, the actual introduction that you make or is made of you is vitally important at the beginning of any preaching engagement. In the broadest sense of the term, the introduction of a speaker to a group of people has two purposes. The first is to relate the audience to the speaker, and the second is to relate the audience to what will be the subject of the talk. Virtually all of the first purpose is accomplished before the speaker opens his mouth, or at least before he or she begins their message proper. The second purpose is accomplished in what is generally thought of as the introduction of the method. So let's consider some ways of helping relate an audience to a speaker. The following are just suggestions for how you can create a positive environment in which allows an audience to relate to the speaker who's standing before them. Some of this is just very, very basic stuff, but they still are important. Things like being appropriately dressed. If you're a man and the occasion calls for wearing a suit, then unless you have a compelling reason not to do so, you should wear a suit, and generally it's seen that suit should be dark blue or grey. Research has confirmed that blue and grey suits project authority and credibility. Now, I'm not being dogmatic in this, and this may not be applicable in many churches today, particularly when they have a younger demographic, but for many traditional churches, denominational churches in the West, it's still the tradition that people in front, at the front should be expected to wear a suit. And when that is the expectation of the congregation, or you gauge it to be the expectation of the congregation, then you should take no chances and do so. It is much less a problem to be overdressed and smarter in appearance than people maybe expect than to be underdressed. But there's no question that in Western civilization, those who wish to speak with authority in most areas, generally like politicians, attorneys, bankers, and executives, still traditionally wear dark blue and grey almost exclusively. When going to a church, even a fairly modern contemporary church where the people will be dressed quite relaxed, and as an attendee I would be very comfortable wearing exactly what I want, I would still tend to wear a suit, and then if appropriate and it seems that the place is extremely relaxed in its dress code, I would then tend to remove the jacket and tie and just talk with a plain white or coloured shirt. Whole books have been written on proper dress for men and women, particularly in relation to business. But the point I'm trying to make is general. You should follow the local condition or the environments that is the norm for the place that you're going to speak in. It is not a good idea to deflect too much from what people expect, which is all about being sensitive to the congregation. Before any message is delivered, most speakers will concentrate on the content of the message, and that, of course, is not wrong. That, of course, is quite appropriate. However, just before you speak, you should take a few minutes to think about the potential audience. Try and put yourself in the place of those sitting in the congregation in front of you and try and understand where they're coming from. Remember, virtually everyone there will have a problem or problems of some sort. What I mean by that is virtually everyone, has a need. Now, as a Christian preacher who is bringing a message, you can confidently say that the majority of people in front of you will need something of what you have to say. Think of them as people who need what you're about to tell them and adopt the attitude of expecting them to respond positively to the message. Beware of showing negative thoughts or attitudes, such as the attendance maybe is not what expected. If there's very few people there, don't comment at it. Your attitude should be entirely positive for those people who've made the effort to come and sit before you. Your attitude, this is important because your attitude, whether positive or negative, will seep through to the audience and it will have an effect on how they receive your message. If you're feeling and appear positive, that will have a positive influence on how the message is received, as will the negative if you are in any way appearing negative to them. At the end of the day, the people who have come to hear you speak should not have to pay in any emotional way for the ones who have chosen not to come. So at least think very positively and favourably towards those who at the end of the day have chosen to come out and hear what you have to say. Now, a very important thing I believe, is to be introduced properly. Sadly, I have to say that is not my experience, and I haven't seen a marked decrease in the fact of any form of a competent or professional introduction of me as a speaker in many places that I go these days. But the rule of introducing a speaker to the audience is that introduction should and of itself build confidence in the congregation of the person who's about to speak. Specifically, an introduction should give any relevant qualifications of the speaker for speaking on the subject. I'm not just talking about academic, I'm talking about qualifications because of their history of service, their position in the church community that they belong to, things like that, or just their life experience. In other words, tell the congregation, tell the people gathered why they should listen and attend to the speaker and why what he has to say on the subject will be worthwhile and even relevant. This could involve discussing, of course, on some occasions, the education or qualifications, the fact that they're being called to ministry, but the life experience is also an important factor, and all of these things can be drawn together. All of these are done not to lift up the speaker as somebody special or better than anyone else, just to demonstrate that they are qualified to be there and that what they have to say should be weighted with some authority. I believe the name of the speaker should be clearly stated, probably twice within the introduction, at the beginning and at the end. It's helpful also for the one introducing the speaker to add any personal touch if they can. Certainly if that's the case and it's known, it's a good thing to comment favourably on something about the speaker or the person or the introducer's personal relationship to the speaker. So as a speaker, do not hesitate to tell the person who will introduce you what to say if they don't know anything about you. Do not assume that they know that just because you've been chosen to introduce you, that they will have been given either the least bit of instruction or the least, or the tiniest amount of information about you. Actually, sometimes I have a very short essay, a paragraph of a few key things about myself, which I am more than willing to hand over to the person introducing, so that they can have something to base what they're going to say on. Having been introduced, well, probably hundreds of times as a speaker in my life, I can tell you from experience that the one call to introduce you as a speaker will not view that negatively. They'll really appreciate those few notes that you give them. I have found that I don't think I've ever had someone react badly to me doing that. Every time I've done it, the person who's been given the task of introducing is just thankful to have some extra information and don't mind being told what to say in a sense at all. The other thing is, if you are someone who's introducing the speaker, don't take that part of the evening or day lightly. Done properly, an introduction of the speaker will greatly enhance the effectiveness of what he has to say. And of course, in our remit, what we have to say is about the life-changing power of the gospel and the word of God. Conversely, if the introduction is done sloppily, it can make being effective as a preacher much more difficult for you. In a sense, the introduction of a speaker is a bit like the wrapping of a present. A gift handed to you in a scruffy brown bag would not arouse your interest nearly as much as one tastefully, thoughtfully, and carefully wrapped. Sadly, today I find that about 50% of the time when I speak, I am not introduced at all except by my name. So these days, I always carry my ready prepared summary paragraph of who I am and what my ministry and my experience is. And if I'm being formally introduced by someone, I make sure I make that available to them. And if they're not, I use it as the basis of my own introduction. Experience tells me another useful little tip is to approach the podium, the pulpit, the lectern, approach it confidently. I believe a preacher should always be seen to walk calmly and confidently to the pulpit in such a way as to build confidence in the congregation, but also to relax them. It doesn't appear cocky, and I would also recommend that you don't speak until you're standing behind the actual podium, it says. In fact, when you get to the podium of the pulpit, I suggest that you pause and you look at the people for just a moment before you say anything. A common mistake of an inexperienced speaker is to rush or even to begin speaking before they get to the pulpit, which in larger churches which use microphone applications means what you say, the first things you say, the attention grabber even that you use as you first speak, will not be actually heard by 90% of the congregation. Now, importantly, if you're nervous, that's perfectly reasonable. You may be nervous because you haven't spoken publicly very much, or because the subject of your sermon on that occasion could be tricky. You can relieve that tension in yourself, which will be translated to the congregation. It's just at the point that you arrive at the pulpit to take a deep breath and relax, just as you stand there for a moment behind the podium, before you've even uttered a single word. Those fleeting few seconds, but the time it takes you to take a long, steady breath, it may seem like an eternity to you, but if done that way, it is not so for the audience. That sitting from the audience points of view actually projects confidence. It'll make it look like you're confident, professional, and sure enough about what you say to not to be nervous or want to rush into it. It's always good, always good to sincerely thank everyone for being there. On some occasions, such as a pastor speaking on a Sunday morning to a congregation, it may be appropriate to begin with introducing yourself, particularly if the congregation have been given no more than the information of who you are and where you're from. If you've been given a decent introduction, then you have the luxury of going straight into your own introduction without speaking personally to the audience. This can be especially effective if you want to open your message with an attention grabber, like a bold statement, a question, or a humorous observation. But on all occasions, it's best, I believe, if you introduce yourself, at least introduce yourself and say thank you for everyone for coming. Now, then you begin to need to start speaking and to open your message. And on most occasions, speakers often begin by either saying something about themselves or something complimentary about the church or the congregation. If you are going to compliment the people that are in front of you, then you need to say it concisely. In other words, be specific and truthful, and say it sincerely or don't say it at all. Say it deeply and mean it. Find the positive aspect that you can draw attention to and be thankful for it. But also say it briefly. Be short. If you're going to use humour, use it very wisely in your introduction. Many speakers seem to be of the opinion that it's pretty much de rigueur that they tell a joke before they speak. And there's no doubt that humour can go a long way in relating an audience to a speaker and preparing them for what he's about to say. In other words, saying, this is going to be a relaxed, fun time. And we all know a good laugh is as good as medicine. And causing people to laugh or chuckle at the beginning that can communicate that you're a relaxed, confident and happy person, and what we're going to have together will be a stimulating and perhaps even an enjoyable time. But this does not mean, however, contrary to what some speakers think, is that you must tell a joke before you speak. You can do it, but if you use humour, you've got to make sure it's in good taste, and it should be very brief, and you shouldn't overdo it. But if you're using humour, be very aware of the risk of what you're saying having a double meaning, something you may not have thought about or noticed. And I don't think you should ever use sarcasm, although that's a popular form of humour today, but in the congregational setting, it can be highly dangerous. Perhaps unless you were speaking to a group of listeners who are especially young and open-minded, but be careful never to poke fun at the people sitting in front of you. Never use ethnic jokes unless you're a member of the ethnic group itself. And ideally, if you're a speaker who uses humour, when you first get up to speak, the humour should be directed to the occasion or the subject, something humorous about the subject of what you're going to talk to, rather than the people. Now, sometimes I very gently poke fun at the reputation of an area, if it has a particularly wealthy or middle class sort of aspect to it, but never ever poke fun at an area if it's struggling or it has social problems. I take the principle that when I'm talking, if I do use humour, I always make sure I'm doing what comedians call punching up. Also, avoid making trite and facile remarks. Worn out, overused introductory expressions, churchy expressions like "it is a joy for me to be here," they come across to people nowadays as hollow and fake. So try, if you can, to say something positive, but look at the positive characteristics of the church. Comment on the church's ministry, things that you're aware of that they do, and how appreciated it is, how well you think they do it, and how good that particular aspect of service is within that church family. But whereas all these preliminary opening techniques are useful, You must remember that your core point is to come and make the main message, to do the main exposition of the Bible passage, and remain committed to doing that message. Don't get carried away with a lengthy, humorous introduction. By the time you arrive at the pulpit, hopefully people should know roughly what you're going to say that day, and that message should remain uppermost in your mind, and you're in the process of introducing it into their minds. If you keep that in mind, then your attitude, I believe, will subtly seep through to the congregation itself. So after whatever preliminary marks are made, they're designed, the important thing is you must remember they should be designed and focused to relate you to the congregation, to move with purpose to the introduction proper, which is designed to relate the audience to the subject you're about to speak on. Now, there are several methods of connecting and relating an audience to the subject. An old Russian proverb said, "Men are the same as donkeys. To hold them fast, you must get a good grip of their ears." So the introduction of an effective message creates a need for the audience to listen to a message on that particular subject. And specifically, there are three things the introduction of a message, I believe, three things it should accomplish. All three, directly or indirectly, what they do is they simply relate the audience to the subject. The first group of methods I'm going to give the banner of as calling them attention getters. The first thing an introduction should do is to grab the attention of the audience. Don't assume that just because you have a Bible in your hand and you've stepped into a pulpit or behind a lectern that the people in the pews are going to give you their full attention. A few people in every congregation will perhaps have come to hear what you as a speaker have to say, but many, perhaps the majority, will have other things on their mind. Therefore, it's imperative that you as a preacher go after those minds of the hearers to force them to engage and listen to you. This is so important that one lecturer in preaching said this: if the preacher does not capture attention in the first 30 seconds, they may never gain it again. Now, getting attention can be accomplished with the very first sentence. Sometimes it will take a paragraph, or sometimes it can be grabbed, attention can be grabbed by presenting a problem immediately into the hearer's mind, one that needs to be solved. First sentence attention getters include things like the use of a familiar quotation, asking the congregation a question, making a captivated statement, or presenting them with a paradox, a puzzle that they need to solve. A captivating statement could be a novel idea or a striking re-expression of a familiar old idea. At any rate, any number of sentences can be used, from a single sentence up into a short paragraph, but that opening should be used to grab the ears, as I've said, of that audience. Sometimes I ask a rhetorical question. Things like, have you ever doubted that you have eternal life? That's one I've used on several occasions, covering several different messages. Many people in the decades now of public ministry that I've been involved with, I've probably spoke to more people who've raised that as a problem, people who appear to have a lack of assurance of eternal life. That is one of the most common questions that I get asked. So using that as an attention grabber at the beginning of a message, I've found really effective. Other rhetorical questions I've used, a little bit controversially, is sex sinful? Or things like, have you ever been tempted to have an affair? Or if it's a younger group of people, have you ever been tempted to have a one-night stand? Or have you ever been on a date and were tempted to go physically further than you thought? And by the way, sex is not a sin, it's natural, and the passage I was preaching on those occasions is 1 Corinthians 6, verse 12 to 20. So if those questions have resonated with you, go and have a look at that passage. Here's another rhetorical question. Why did God give the law? You see, all of these things, they begin with a problem that the audience feels it needs to solve in their mind. So immediately you've got their attention. Make sure that the message follows and genuinely speaks to the problem, and the introduction raises the problem in the mind of the people that's going to be, to the most part, answered within the text of your main sermon message. But that's only one type of beginning. There are numerous ways to grab hold of people's attention. The other is to tell a story. The speaker may rely on the opening paragraph. To do that, of course, the speaker is needing to rely on maybe an opening paragraph or two instead of just a single opening sentence. But a story or a narration or an illustration will accomplish the goal of gaining attention very effectively. The narration should include action that builds to a sort of climax in the mind of the listeners. In some cases, a biblical sermon could begin with the narration of the background material to get the attention and introduce the sermon. In other words, it's putting the events described, particularly if it's a historical or narrative book, into the form of a short first-person overview of the drama of the events that are happening in the passage you're going to be unpacking. But here are some illustrations of opening paragraphs designed to get attention. Some of them narrative, some of them not. God needs you. That statement is an attention grabber because in people's mind it may appear to be putting something backwards, because what people would normally expect to hear is not that you need God. They would normally expect to hear that you need God rather than that God needs you. Now, granted, an individual needs the Lord. He needs him for forgiveness, for fellowship, for fulfillment. But it is also true that God needs you. Then you continue to say, let me clarify. Now, in this case, the sermon of the text was Nehemiah chapter 11, verses 1 to 3. But generally, the way to begin a sermon, well, it's not endless, but there are many, many. Let me just list for you a few other ways that you can use to commence a sermon and grab people's attention, to grab them by the ears. So they are with a joke, with a quotation, with a definition, with a paradox, a problem that they need to solve in their mind, with a contemporary news item, with a personal observation, with a parable, a story, with a poem, with an image on an overhead projected behind you, perhaps a dramatic image of something that's happened in the world, or even a cartoon. The second thing an introduction should do, besides grabbing attention, is it should create interest in what has to follow. Creating interest is different than just getting attention, so we shouldn't think that an attention grabber just does that and then sits there on its own without leading through to something that creates interest in the subject to follow. A speaker someone standing at the front could get everyone's attention by ringing a bell, but that in itself, it may grab their attention for a second, but it won't create interest in what is going to continue to follow and should thereby hold their attention. But if as a speaker you can genuinely create interest as well, then we will automatically hold people's attention. There's a difference between getting attention and creating a need. The difference between getting attention and creating a need is that it's very easy to get attention. In fact, the easiest way to get attention of people is to say or do something inappropriate. But that shows you that what we do needs to be different, because we need to grab people's attention, but then we need to create a need in their mind and that technique is obviously much more sophisticated and more difficult to pull off. How about this? If you listen to the rest of this session, I will give you £1,000. You could grab hold of people's attention by offering them £1,000 if they listen to your message. That'll gain attention, but it won't really create a need. And they'd probably be disappointed at the end, I would imagine anyway. If you create a need, you will get and hold people's attention. The people sitting in front of you as a preacher or a teacher may, in their mind, they may not express it, but what their mind will be saying is, why do I need to listen to this? So to be effective, you must show them at the beginning, grab hold of their attention, yes, but then you need to follow up immediately by saying something about why what you're about to say is important or relates to them. Now, people have psychological needs such as food, drink, sleep, recreation, even sexual expression are all very important things to people. People have physiological needs. They need things such as food, drink, sleep, recreation, even fellowship and friendship. But as well as that, they have psychological needs such as security, significance, self-worth, self-esteem, self-expression, even self-realization and spiritual development. Along with that, people have sociological needs because they live with other people. These include the need to be loved and to live harmoniously with other people. People also need to know and understand. They have spiritual needs that includes knowing how they can relate to God and walk with Him. Now, there is this buzzword that is one of the catchphrases of our generation, which is called felt needs. People are more apt to listen to a speaker if they think what he is about to say will actually meet one of these things called felt needs. And this is a useful phrase for us to understand, because the teacher of the word, we as preachers and teachers, in reality are trying to offer an answer to a need, and in reality, the deepest needs that people have are not even felt. What we feel are usually wants, but the needs of people out there that we're speaking to, they go much deeper and at a much more profound level. And many of them may not even recognize the need they have until it's pointed out to them. So how does a speaker create interest in an audience to listen to the subject he's about to speak on? Simply announcing the subject might create a degree of interest, but will it hold it? Only if the subject is of interest to the individuals within the audience. But if the audience's interest about the subject is in doubt, then the speaker needs to create interest. You need to create interest by showing the relevance of the subject to their lives. And by far and away, the most effective way to create interest is to touch a deeply felt personal need in the people sitting in front of you. Touching a need that people feel will get their attention and will create interest in what you have to say. Now, there are other recognized techniques for creating interest. For example, vivid creative word choice has a way of not only getting attention, but also creates an interest in the speaker and his speech. Years ago, it occurred to me that after I'd studied a passage of scripture and I felt I had its truth in hand, what I actually possessed at that point was an answer to a question, a solution, if you like, to a common problem. In other words, in deciding how the passage should be taught, I said to myself, you know what, I have an answer here. So all I needed to find out was how to express the question, because I had the solution. So I needed to put the question, find out what the problem was, you sort of drill down into it, and then put it in the form of a question. I then put that question or that problem, I put it in the introduction, direct to the congregation in the introduction, and then reveal the passage as an answer or a solution to that problem. But anyway, regardless of how I begin, whether it was with a question, whether it's with a starting statement, a joke, a story, etc., between the introduction and the first point, I always try and make sure they know the question or the issue or the problem that this passage will hopefully solve. In other words, I try to tell them that I'm going to try and provide them with an answer at some level today. From this day, the single most important comment I have received concerning my preaching is that it was helpful. Now, when I get that response, I often ask the person, in what way was it helpful? And usually they then go on to tell me because it answered a question that they had, and they would perhaps express what that question was. After introducing hundreds and hundreds of sermons over the years, I have concluded that asking a question in the introduction, one that, of course, you're going to need to answer in the subject, is probably one of the best ways of getting attention, but not only of getting attention, but creating interest in the subject and at the same time introducing the subject. So let's just think a moment about what it means to introduce the subject. Because the introduction of the subject is the third thing that the introduction should do. It sort of goes without saying, doesn't it, that an introduction should introduce. But unfortunately, I would say that every Sunday, thousands, perhaps millions of churchgoers every week are up to their neck in the middle of a sermon and are still asking the question, what are we actually talking about here? So the introduction, an effective introduction of a message must at the very least introduce the subject of what's going to be talked about. It may and should do more than that, but it must at least reveal the whole idea, the big idea of what's to follow, and maybe perhaps even give an outline of what's to follow. But the very least it should do is introduce the topic of the message. And you'd be amazed how many times I've listened to introductions that don't do that. The introduction of the subject or the big idea should naturally flow out and follow whatever else has been said in the introduction up to that point. But also importantly, the introduction should not promise any more or any less than the message will actually deliver. There are two dangers in an introduction. One is that you overkill, and the other is that you underkill. In overkill, maybe as a speaker, you can promise too much, more than the message will deliver. It's a bit like an overly detailed introduction. It's a bit like digging the foundation for a skyscraper, but end up only putting a garden shed on the plot. Sensational introductions to mediocre sermons actually, for the people listening to them, they feel a little bit like a broken promise. When a preacher fails to meet the need that he is raised in the mind of the congregation, a congregation can feel cheated. So don't use a fantastic introduction just because you found someone somewhere or an illustration somewhere. Don't use it, friends, if you don't have the message to follow it. Save it for another day. I have a 30-page document containing over 20,000 words filled with some fantastic illustrations, stories and introductions. I'm sure there's over 100 of them, and I've not used any of them yet. Keep them for another day. In underkill, the opposite, speakers do not reveal their subject. They don't tell people where they're going and how they're going to get there, and people therefore enter the beginning of the main part of the message not understanding where they're meant to be going mentally and what they're meant to need to learn out of it, what they're meant to pick out of what's being said. So to summarize, effective messages, they should have introductions that relate the audience to the speaker and to the subject of the speech. That introduction should be long enough to catch their attention, raise needs, and orientate the audience towards the subject, the big idea, or the first point. And until that is done, an introduction is incomplete. But if it continues beyond that remit, then it's going too far. An old woman was famously quoted as saying of her old Welsh preacher that he was so long spreading the table, she lost her appetite for the meal. In terms of time, In my estimation, the introduction should be in length about 10% of the allocated speaking time. But however long that introduction is, or the complete message is, the first 25 words should really grab people's attention.